Sweet. The early 2000s was a particularly fruitful and busy period for the Williams-Spielberg-Lucas love triangle. The director's usual tennis match with Williams was in full swing, and by 2002 he was producing his third, fourth, fifth and sixth scores of this new millennium in a single year, and 2 of them were for Spielberg alone. This era arguably produced some of the finest work of his career, if not the medium at large, continuing to permeate the Hollywood musical landscape with his late romantic inspired leitmotivic symphonic writing. But whereas the continuation of those franchises with Lucas and Chris Columbus, technically perfect as they were more an exercise in the expansion of existing sound worlds, his projects with Spielberg then allowed him to return to some earlier jazz influences, and indeed later eras of symphonic writing, particularly in AI, artificial intelligence, referencing the motoric repeating cells of classical minimalism for its evocations of a mechanized modern world. Throughout the 90s, an idea for a sequel to 1990's Total Recall was optioned by multiple studios, eventually finding a home at Amblin Entertainment in 1998 as its own standalone project, Minority Report, an adaptation of Philip K. Dick's story with Steven Spielberg attached to direct. It ultimately became the vehicle for a much discussed and first of 2 collaborations between himself and Tom Cruise after their initial meeting in the 1980s. It follows Cruise as John Anderton, the lead detective of a futuristic pre-crime police department in Washington, D.C., where would-be murderers are arrested and incarcerated before the act, thanks to the nightmarish visions of 3 precognitives. Grieving and guilt-ridden following the tragic loss of his young son, Anderton puts everything he has into pre-crime, headed by Max von Sydow's Lamar Burgess, and in breakout roles, Colin Farrell and Samantha Morton as the key precognitive.
She's the key.
While Minority Report was somewhat of an uplift for Spielberg following AI's middling, critical and commercial performance, its score received more muted reviews, a rarity for Williams. And as one of his least conventionally motivic scores, with a lesser explored set of tonal influences, it still stands out over 2 decades later as being one of his most intriguing.
Wally.
Now, as a quick disclaimer, it's no accident that arguably one of, if not the finest Hollywood film composer hasn't been discussed until episode 9 of this series. Thanks to that status, he's garnered a passionate fan base, very easy to discourage a relative layman of the orchestral realm from commenting with any authority. But elitism is hardly surprising when discussing someone who is demonstrably the elite in their field, and it's always done from a great love and passion for his work, which I of course share. The series would be remiss not to consider his incredible influence on the medium, so with that in mind, Williams made his start as a Juilliard graduate jazz pianist, playing and orchestrating under legendary Golden Age composers like Henry Mancini and, importantly for Minority Report, Bernard Herrmann. Many composers of this bygone era, like Max Steiner, were part of the European émigré, whose school of composition was greatly influenced by, and in many ways a continuation of, the late Romantic and early modern movements, which has been dutifully taken on by Williams right up to the present day through both his unrelenting schedule of film scores and indeed his lesser-known concert works. His early works for TV already evidence much of these influences. a formula of citation and iteration as innovation, he'd continued in his later work for film to a profound degree and to astronomical success. Not only do his allegiances to older greats manifest in referenced, sometimes quoted, melodic or rhythmic material, but also in the coloration of his orchestrations, where certain instrumental timbres are given certain notes within a chord, has a huge impact on our perception, even if subconsciously, on a musical idea's similarity to another known work, and then perhaps its shared emotional evocations. In our internet age, attitudes towards intellectual property in popular music, aside from perhaps sampling, have occasionally and I think unfairly been applied to Williams's work, though accusations of plagiarism have thankfully left his reputation untarnished. His borrowings are a form of homage and citation that long predates popular music, and one that is written into the DNA of orchestral music. And in some respects, art more widely. As Andy Hill states, allusions within a work to other works, thematically or structurally connected to it, are called intertextual references. It's a critical element of art making because no work of art subsists entirely on its own without reference to others. In fact, it's a way of acknowledging your sources and tapping into their emotional wellspring. After all, Vaughan Williams did it. In some ways, this system of reference is a device unto itself through which Williams is continuing to carry the mantle of symphonic music, or at least those faithful interpretations of those eras of it, into the 21st century. Despite all of the technological musical innovation of the later 20th century, it was Williams's compounding landmark successes with Lucas's and Spielberg's franchises that were the initial catalyst for this neo-golden age romantic revival in scoring, and perhaps because of that, for the lasting relevance of symphonic storytelling in the medium at large. The film's dystopian and utopian intersections were advised upon by a think tank of science and technology experts, speculating on the potential progression and evolution of technology, infrastructure, infectious diseases,
it's damn cold,
surveillance capitalism,
John Anderson, you could use a Guinness right about now.
and climate. They later described the film as much grayer and more ambiguous in its production, presumably as Spielberg, alongside cinematographer Janusz Kaminski, sought to visually match the film's stark themes through overlighting and a partial bleach bypass film process, which stylistically desaturates and adds a bunch of grain to the film stock. This tonal shift for the usually very warm and sentimental Spielberg found its way into the score. He said, "The plot and story find their roots in the American film noir and the classic whodunit mysteries. We've often marveled at the way Bernard Herrmann was able to contribute so much musical suspense to an Alfred Hitchcock picture. So, in that tradition of mystery, suspense, and film noir, John has fashioned a fast-paced yet dark portrait of America in the year 2054. John's score for Minority Report is not lush with melody, it is nonetheless brilliant in its complexity and forceful in its rhythms. If most of John's scores for my films have been in colour, I think of this score as his first one in black and white." Williams's earlier repertoire is certainly not lacking in experimentation. But despite his compositional diversity, his overall stylistic legacy and imprint as his voice has matured tends to be that of lush arrangements and warm, late romantic colours for his most iconic scores, here quite akin to composers like Howard Hanson. But Minority Report's score is decidedly more modernist, an era of great experimentalism, and importantly, historically relevant for the film's genre conventions it attempts to adhere to. As Barham states, from the time of Gottfried Herbert's original modernist score for Lang's Metropolis, the science fiction genre has given composers and directors greater opportunities for experimentation than most others. In Minority Report, these colours, although still ever earnest and occasionally sentimental in the emotional work they have to do for certain narrative threads, are now in themselves desaturated and ambiguous. He does this through many techniques: imperfect cadences and sparse melodic material with lots of suspensions and loose ends, and he captures many of those film noir tropes and influences through a great number of compositional considerations. For Minority Report's take on the film noir, its ever-changing mystery and frequent strong action, movement is key. Williams proves time after time that he is a master of musical movement, both rhythmically and harmonically, and where movement denotes a much more internal and emotive struggle melodically as well. The score harmonically meanders with little regard to fixed tonal centers. These harmonic shifts are particularly present in the disorienting action cues. So many Williams scores accompany chases or battle sequences with multiple grand set pieces, where harmonic modulation goes a long way to help demarcate the interwoven scenes sonically. And he frequently uses chord planing, a kind of abrupt, direct transposition of the chord shape up or down, usually with a third interval. In Minority Report, he does this in the cue Remembering Sean, with these Herman-esque winds, not necessarily to modulate the already unstable key center, but within a phrase, going from an implied F minor up a major third interval to an A minor, with these incongruent major sevenths in the oboe melody. He frequently modulates chromatically too. In the spider scene, he repeats a 4-bar polytonal counterpoint of sorts, using the 7th and 2nd degree quite prominently to modulate down to this new key center, going down a semitone with each repetition. He also uses this means of chromatic descent on Anderton's approach to Leo Crow's hotel room, the killer of his child, subtly outlining the inevitable pull down to his predetermined murder of his child's killer.
I am going to kill this man.
Through these devices, he's able to provide musical momentum without even thinking about rhythmic motor to do so. But when Williams does lean into rhythmic devices for action in Minority Report, it's actually rarely all that percussive in instrumentation, at least relatively speaking. While a more modern style of score may use huge percussion sections for rhythmic gravitas, and potentially often competing with booming sound effects and then having the opposite desired effect, Williams's meticulous syncopation and use of tuplets and triple meter disorient our sense of tempo and acts as a means of metric modulation. And he does this with predominantly pitched instruments, with only occasional percussive punctuations, a mirror of what Herman was able to do with his strings-only score for Psycho. This becomes a seamless, organic, sonic extension of both the on-screen action within the frame and indeed the frame's edit itself. It's a discipline very few working composers have a mastery of, at least without the aid of the digital environment, with this compositional dexterity largely attributable to his continued use of pen and manuscript paper at the piano to this day, writing a condensed orchestration to then later be expanded and engraved by a rotating team of trusted orchestrators. Clearly, technology is not everything. Williams' writing ubiquitously incorporates polytonality or polymodality, depending on the school of composition, with coinciding disparate key centers, providing tension through controlled dissonances that are able to represent all manner of internal narrative conflict. But perhaps most notably in Minority Report, his clashing counterpoint and stacked dissonant chords beneath frantic ostinati amount to an ominous and mysterious urgency where Williams is really in a class of his own. In true Herman fashion, in quieter detective scenes, he moves these stacked chords melodically, and in the context of Minority Report's Manhunt, the second and third voicings become the shadow at his heels almost, and the emotional complexity and subtlety with which these supposedly conflicting keys are combined can work wonders in service of the film's psychological and disorienting elements. Rossi refers to these as melodie d'accords, roughly translated to chord melodies. I guess an application of parallel harmony where a melody and its double move together with a constant interval, and Williams's works are littered with them.
Hello there.
He also doesn't shy away from melody in a more conventional sense either, despite this being a far less motivic score, though he largely avoids the rousing heroism of brass fanfare and lyrical string choir for character motif, as Anderton is certainly no hero in the conventional sense. The relative melodic ambiguity we do get beautifully portrays the film's own moral ambiguities in our protagonists corrupted by their grief, our supposed antagonists much the same.
He was shot and killed when I was 15 on the steps of our church in Dublin.
And indeed the central philosophical quandaries and paradoxes of preemptive incarceration and predeterminism, respectively. His incredible melodic sensibilities are often given to solo instruments, and while certainly not a device exclusive to film noir, or indeed film at all in context of the concerto, for example, a solo part can be incredibly descriptive for the often isolated and lonely characters of film noir. Minority Report sees Williams ascribe a mournful melody to the grieving Anderton through this solo oboe line, capturing the loneliness and isolation of his life without Sean and lamenting his untimely and presumably solitary death. It's made all the more heart-wrenching in hindsight, as the theme's earliest appearance should have been in the unused cue image of Sean. There, the melody doubled on flutes and strings for the scene where Anderton is watching home movies of a time where the three of them were still together, the three instrument families doing much the same. The isolation inherent in the solo part is perhaps never felt more viscerally than when it's produced by the human voice. Part of the salience of Anderton and Agatha's relationship is their mirrored loss of child and parent. And in the cue Agatha Sees All, we hear most prominently and heart-wrenchingly a lament of the mother who lost a daughter, channeled through the daughter who lost the mother. Williams's prequel score for AI also channeled this maternal device to some degree, where Monica's theme acts as a lullaby of sorts. But in its fullest manifestation here, it has a far more aggressive and tragic characteristic sung by Deborah Dietrich. Centered around this minor mode, but with raised seventh degree, in combination with the prominent register breaks in her performance, there's kind of these allusions to the Bulgarian female chorus. It's more aesthetically aligned in today's context with Noir Kotler's performances for Hans Zimmer's Dune. Kind of injects a pseudo Middle Eastern flavor, and in so doing also perhaps a biblical sacrificial theme of the tragedy of the prophetic child lost to the machinations of the systems beyond their control. Williams frequently uses the wooden sonorities of marimba and xylophone, and here alongside other more kind of ethnic percussion, for a temporal urgency. And in Minority Report, he does much the same with this repetitive wooden sound, its dryness and its rhythmic constancy, suggesting a cold and logical inevitability to pre-crime's unrelenting pursuit. They're motoric and mechanical, with their sampled-like quality being a clinical and corporate textural evocation of the earlier pre-crime infomercial.
Only a miracle could stop the bloodshed. But instead of one miracle, we were given three, the precognitives.
There's a brief allusion to it in the containment chamber as well. They're having almost a user interface-like chime quality.
Look at how peaceful they all seem.
Trivializing to some degree the moral weight of the surrounding prisoners who have not committed any crime. But these woods become less false and more organic in the chase sequences and the action cues. Doubling the string and woodwind runs and brass stabs, as he does in numerous other cues in other scores, for its kind of frenetic quality. Much more akin to a symphonic scherzo. From my very basic understanding, a scherzo is often a third movement of a symphonic work, fast-paced and humorous, often in triple meter. They're an influential format for the typical Williams chase cue, and more modern 20th century examples that maybe did away with some of the more overtly humorous signifiers certainly share some connective tissue with the standard Williams action writing. It's not only the wooden mallet percussion that alludes to classical minimalism. Which by 2002 had already found repeated relevance and appreciation in Hollywood scoring. Williams incorporates other motoric cells earlier on in the score, again to signify pre-crime. We hear a repeating cell which is progressed not by pedal notes or counterpoint or harmonic modulation, but by passing and doubling and unison throughout different instrument families, playing the same repeating cell above these dynamic clustered swells in the backdrop. Though, of course, whether motoric cell or just simple ostinato, it's open to interpretation based on genre convention. We hear a wood block keep tempo in this atypical meter, their dotted groupings syncopating, disorienting, and adding further urgency to this time-critical opening of the film. He'll also use metallic or glass-like sonorities for certain thematic signifiers. The glass harmonica, or at least a synth-embellished allusion to its timbre and ethereal quality, is used quite prominently in the greenhouse scene where Anderton speaks to Hinneman, playing this very small motif alluding to an A-flat minor tonality, but touching upon a flat second, augmented fourth, and major third. Williams' tried and tested use of the celeste and other metallophones help portray Anderton's lucid dream of Sean's disappearance at the swimming pool, bookended by this whole tone or octatonic harp arpeggio and doubled on the piano. The celeste also adds textural, dreamy significance to the precogs, who indeed live their life through dreamlike premonitions. I feel like it's almost Williams's version of Herman's dreamlike vibraphone with its motor oscillation. There's another soft, metallic, potentially synthesized or hybrid vibraphone texture in the unused cue Witwer snooping. Which to me is super reminiscent of Williams's cue for the invisibility cloak in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Really channeling the mysterious, ethereal nature of those vibes-like sonorities, peppered through Herman's scores, particularly relevant to the Twilight Zone. The way all of this instrumentation is wielded is also decidedly modernist through extended techniques. A plethora of playing styles grew in use and indeed notoriety throughout 20th century concert music. They include, but are certainly not limited to, exaggerated tremoli, often in polytonal clusters, sul ponticello, bowing the string close to the bridge, giving an icy, brittle timbre, upper harmonics in strings and winds for extremes of pitch, bartok pizzicato, named for the composer who brought it to prominence, where the string is slapped against the fingerboard, collegno, playing with the wood of the bow on the string, extreme dynamics in muted or stopped brass, and seemingly every permutation thereof, often being physically challenging to listen to and often the intent of those initiating composers. These techniques bled into film in the later 20th century, in no small part due to Williams's own use of them, and again, of course, in science fiction. Alongside other modernist placements in film and the reciprocal relevance and effectiveness of these techniques, from audience literacy in their intended emotive signposting, they've become a very valid but potentially expected toolbox in a composer's arsenal, and therefore perhaps a contrived or less effective one. As Barham states, a nucleus of avant-garde musical techniques, primarily centering on intense dissonance, was becoming a commodified emblem of all kinds of on-screen negativity. The last vestiges of creative boldness were to be found in the quasi-ligety sonorities of the early parts of John Williams' Close Encounters score, particularly in scenes of alien abduction. However, these were essentially nullified during the course of the film, whose final scenes of wonderment and sentimentality revealed that we did not need to be afraid of the aliens after all, for they too live in a diatonic world. So then, by the time of Minority Report's composition, a degree of normalization of these once challenging techniques occurred in film music, and by extension a sanitization, desensitization, or trivialization of their emotional affect and the tension and conflict they were once so adept at evoking. Perhaps now that a new and potentially simplified advent of scoring methodologies is firmly upon us.
It just came like, that's it, that's the preset, it's the Rock 1 preset.
And Williams, now mostly, if not fully retired, this now rare complexity may well have done more in today's modern scoring landscape to stand out from the crowd, something that in 2002, alongside 3 other conventionally and arguably more crowd-pleasing scores, was far more difficult for Williams. It's evident from the expanded version of this score that there was a lot of material omitted or spliced and edited together after the fact. Not entirely unexpected given the very rapid turnaround for the score for this picture, both due to his very packed schedule and the sheer cost. Changes to the edit would then need post-production audio edits rather than recomposition and re-recording. But some of the omissions were indeed creative choices, namely the classical music placements. Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony, many scholars believing it to be his last as a suicide note of sorts, features prominently in Anderton's apartment, where he is surrounded by all manner of artifacts of his grief and depression. Its structure, culminating not in triumph but in a slow, long, drawn-out dying or fading away, mirrors then the film's central themes of death. Schubert's Eighth Symphony also features supposedly his unfinished symphony, and it aptly plays in the pre-crime scenes where the murders themselves are unfinished, unable to be completed due to the work of pre-crime. They're just a few examples of how even Williams's incredible bespoke work for a film can be poetically and justifiably replaced through another far more direct intertextual reference, through using diegetic placements of existing music with shared narrative salience, even if only subconsciously or academically received. Williams' usual deep roots in late Romantic influences, motivic and melodic heroism, and lush orchestration means that Minority Report's relative lack of them, alongside that audible widening of influence, makes it one of his most exciting scores, despite it being potentially less memorable as a direct result of all of that. His collection and reintegration of these influences into popular culture is perhaps many audience members' only exposure to these forms of music, and the film being their only gateway to their appreciation of them. Now, there's so much more to explore around the ever-evolving role of the orchestrator, particularly within Williams's more traditional workflow, but the frequency and sheer quality of his incredible output has cemented him as one of the finest, if not the finest, working American composer to date, despite his primary medium just happening to be the silver screen rather than the concert hall. Minority Report is a decidedly atmosphere-forward homage to noir past, using his unique voice and wide pool of influences to portray its future. Despite its often overlooked status in a small corner of a very busy year in the middle of his career, it's beautifully fitting then that within his repertoire it has rightly become the half-remembered dream, the unrealized future, where all you're left with is the memory of how it made you feel while you were listening to it. And perhaps that was always his intent. So, thank you so much if you've made it this far. As always, please like, comment, subscribe. Drop me a message either on YouTube or on my Instagram. Let me know what films you'd like to see covered on Scoring Points. This one was a long time coming. Apologies for the longer wait. I was busy releasing some music last month and glad to get that out there and dive back into some essay writing. So as always, we're going to have a second part of this episode where we're going to go through my recreation of one of my favorite cues from the film. Of course, that's going to be spiders. That's probably going to be out in the next 2 or 3 weeks or so. It's going to be really fun, so watch out for that, and as always I will catch you in the next one.